I'm here at Charleston, South Carolina. I'm standing in front of a building that's constructed like many buildings all over the world. And today is one of the more important videos I'm going to make because we're going to look at symbols on buildings and what they actually mean. Now, this particular building is now termed the United States Custom House. It's said to have been built in the mid-1800s. But when we take a close look at it, we can see the same architecture all over the world. And one of the main things that we really want to take a look at today is the top of the column, which is all crowned with the same plant, which is called acanthus. And when we take a close look at this, we see that this plant is all over buildings, all over the world, and not only buildings, but furniture, wallpaper, jewelry, household goods, especially from the old world. This column at the top has these leaves coming out of it that are said to be what's called acanthus. We notice that not only is it on the top of the column, but it is underneath the overhang, the leaves with the flowers from the plant in the middle. And it continues on. And we're told that these columns are called Corinthian columns. And when there's a scroll on the top, it's called Ionic, and when there's nothing on the top, it's called Doric, and it's said that these columns are tradition from ancient times, Roman and Greece era. But are they really? Is that how they originated? Or is there some other reason why all the architecture around the world uses this exact same leaf? It's time to take a look at that right now. And this is a building that looks almost identical to the building we started with, but yet this is a Methodist church now, and the other building was a government building. And why is that? It said this was built 1848 to 1850. You can be the judge of that. But every symbol on this building is identical to the symbols on the other one, with the acanthus prominently on display. And you'll see as we approach these huge wood doors that the carvings on them are the same flower from that plant, the same leaves around the edge. Even on the doorknob itself are the same leaves. Obviously, this is a symbol held in high esteem and high regard to have it on everything on the building. And why is that? When it's used all over the world, but yet it's said that it came from a really frivolous thing. The reason given for why acanthus is used as a symbol worldwide in architecture and otherwise is actually from a legend called the Legend of Callimachus, which was related by the supposed writer Vitruvius, who was said to have lived from 75 to 15 BC. And I'm just going to relate it briefly here. You can read about it. But legend has it that Callimachus, a Greek architect and sculptor working in the second half of the 5th century BC, was so moved by the sight of a bunch of acanthus leaves crowning the grave of a young girl, it inspired him to reproduce them as the decoration for the capital of a column. The sight inspired the passing Callimachus to create the now famous capital for the pillars at Corinth. And that is what is given as the origin for the Corinthian column and the acanthus used all over the world. And in fact, this article says Corinthian capitals now grace buildings all around the world. It's all because of an unnamed little girl who died 2,500 years ago. Now, you can be the judge as to whether or not you think that this story holds any validity whatsoever as to why the acanthus is used as a symbol all over the world. Meanwhile, we're going to take a look at another story that holds all the promise. You have to look at the symbols on these buildings to really know the secrets of what is really going on and what does the symbol really stand for. Well, in the Bible, the crown that was put on the head of Jesus Christ, when you go and look at the scripture specifically in Matthew, and it says that they fashioned a crown of thorns. And when you look at the word thorns and you translate back to what the original word was in the Greek, the word was acantha, A-K-A-N-T-H-A. Looking at the scripture, Matthew 27:29, and when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. And what we do is use a concordance to go back to the original Greek, and you can see there's numbers next to the words here, and when they had platted a crown of thorns. Thorns is the Greek word 173 in the Strong's Concordance. We click on it, and the original word was acantha, which is the acanthus plant, which the significance of this is acantha, it means a thorn, and originally in Genesis, that was the curse put on mankind. That is the plant that is on everything. And it's very clearly the same plant, acantha. And that plant, which is this plant that is inscribed on everything, is the plant that was put on his head at the crucifixion. And what's the significance of that? Well, the original curse that was put on man in the Garden of Eden when Adam sinned was that the land would be cursed and that it would yield thorns and thistles. In Genesis 3 is given the very first punishment or sentence for disobedience to God by Adam in the garden. In Genesis 3:17 we read, and unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. It's the very first punishment given as a result of man's disobedience or sin. And when we click on that and bring the numbers of the concordance up, you see here it says thorns is the Hebrew word 6975, which is actually a word that says kotzi that was translated into thorn from 6972 in the sense of pricking a thorn, the exact same thing as the Greek word acanthus. And Jesus took that curse on himself. Symbolically, he took it on himself by the crown being placed on his head of the exact plant that is the thorns and thistles plant. And it's also a plant that looks almost exactly like a grapevine. And the amazing thing is that it is actually wondered by many if it's even a real plant, because although it's on every type of building and it's on every sort of woodwork and just about every type of thing all over the world, it's actually not found growing like a plant in real life. It can't be found. It's like it's disappeared. And why is that? Well, I'm just examining the things that are. when you start to study it, and I've read a couple dissertations, doctorate dissertations on this issue, on what the acanthus plant is and why is it used all over the world, and the conclusions of the dissertations are that they really don't know, that basically it's said that it is just a means of decoration that became tradition, or possibly a Greek fable, or other things like that. But the reason why the plant is drawn how it is because it said that originally an original artist embellished it and used their own creativity to come up with representations out of their imagination. And that's why this plant has been represented in the way that it has, with a winding vine that has berries on it, and is called a scroll. If you actually do a search on acanthus scroll, you'll find that there are representations used all over the world in architecture of this plant. But yet it's not found anywhere. Is that because Jesus Christ took on the curse and this was an actual real thing? And this plant at the time when God said that thorns would come forth, that this was the plant that came forth, and when he took it upon himself, that it eliminated this plant on the earth and it was no more, and it's used as the symbol of his ruleship on this earth. And these columns are representations of the ruleship of God on earth. The first time a column is used in the Bible, it is when God is leading his people out of bondage by a pillar of fire by night and cloud by day. And that word pillar is the same word that is column, and that means the ruling power or the king on earth. And kings always have taken their oath next to a column in antiquity. The column represents the ruling power, and the capital or the top of the column is the crown of the column and represents that power. And this crown on this column is acanthus, the very curse that Jesus Christ took upon himself, and it is placed on the top of the column as the crown of the kingdom. Is it because all these buildings were built by his kingdom on this earth, just as he said that he would shortly return and establish his 1,000-year kingdom, just as is and was prophesied in the Bible? Are these all remnants of the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth, marked by the crown of the kingdom on top of the ruling column, which is exactly what Jesus Christ took upon himself, which is the curse? And the acanthus now has been completely destroyed on this earth, and the remnants are left in all the buildings, symbolism, and everything else that's all over the world that you'll see constantly everywhere you look, because it represented the glorious kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth and the freedom from that curse. This is food for thought, and there's really no other explanation that I see anywhere that can make any sense of this. This plant, when you research this, it's amazing because it is very clearly depicted as a vine that looks very close to a grape. And when the scripture says you don't get grapes of thorns or figs of thistles, that means you don't get grapes from acanthus or figs from trebolos. Those are the Greek words. We really get some clues into the mystery surrounding this plant starting in Matthew 7:15, where the context is, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And this analogy uses the acanthus plant, the thorn, as an analogy of something that's difficult to tell apart. Obviously, it's depicted as having berries that seem to look like grapes, but in Matthew 7:16, it says, "Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles?" And when we go to the concordance, we look at those words, and it says, gather grapes of. Well, of means off of, and thorns is the Greek word 173, which is acantha again. So that's, do men gather grapes from acanthus? Well, by the looks of how they are depicted in architecture and all sorts of renderings and things like that, it looks like it. But obviously from this analogy, it's saying those kind of grapes, the normal kind, aren't gathered from acanthus or thorns, or figs of thistles. Thistles is the Greek word 5146, which is tribolos, and it's made up of the word tri, meaning three, and the second part of it means spear or arrow. And so three-pronged obstruction in war, that is by analogy a thorny plant. These are both thorny plants that are obviously hard to tell apart from a grape plant, as Jesus is using this analogy for testing the character of false prophets that come to you. But in so doing, it shows a clue into what the plant is. Do men gather grapes from thorns or figs from thistles, or off of thistles? And at the bottom it says, wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. So obviously the fruit is drastically different, but the plant is difficult to tell apart on the surface. And there is the possibility that the original thorn designation pertained to the nature of it being troublesome rather than it being sharp. And tribolos is what has become the fleur de lis and is said to be a flower of a lily, but in fact it's the thorn, the tribolos, and that's why it is always represented, as you can see in the center there at the top. You can see the three-pointed thorn with the acanthus swirling around it. And grapes of thorns, the word thorns originally was acantha. And is that why you have to know them by their fruits? Because they look the same on the outside, but inward, it is not at all the same fruit. The reason why this is so important is because we're trying to identify a symbol that is used on buildings, architecture, furniture, wallpaper, decoration all over the world. But we're trying to identify why that is. And in so doing, it seems as though the plant that is now called acanthus today is not the same plant that was being referred to in the Bible and that is being put on everything for decorations all over the world. And it's as if the plant has been substituted for another plant. In other words, the plant that's called acanthus now is not this plant, and this plant does not exist any longer. And in looking for this plant and not finding it anywhere but only in art and in symbols and on buildings and most every sort of thing from the 1800s that you can imagine, whether it's a hairbrush or a piece of furniture or a picture, just everything was completely permeated with this plant that seems to imitate a grapevine, but is not, and in fact is the thorn talked about in the Bible. And by substituting this plant for another plant and calling it the acanthus in the modern day, which really looks to be something like elephant ears, or a plant that's very similar to that, but not that, of course. Another variety at the very least, completely another variety that doesn't imitate the grapevine, and by also calling the acanthus symbols in architecture and otherwise by different names, such as the palmette and the fleur-de-lis, when they clearly seem to be a part of the ancient acanthus plant. By doing that, it covers up what is in Scripture and why this symbol is on every type of building, especially when looking at old world type buildings everywhere, which seems to be the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth that has already taken place. And by covering this symbol up and saying it's a Greek fable or just decoration and never even mentioning the association in the Bible, I've never actually heard it mentioned by anybody. The truth remains hidden, but yet, as I've shown you, it's right there in plain sight. And this is a clue to the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth that was prophesied and is prophesied, and using this evidence shows that it has taken place, and this is the beautiful remnants of that, which makes all the difference, because that puts us in a different time now. And what is that time? That time is spelled out very clearly in Revelation 20, in which Satan is released at the end of the 1,000-year captivity, in which he was put in prison for 1,000 years. He's released to go and deceive all the nations. The period of time that he's allowed to go deceive the nations in Revelation 20 in the King James Version is termed a little season. It's also called a short season, a short time. And this is the time that he has to deceive all the nations. And at the culmination of this, he gathers all of them to go up against the camp of the saints. What is this? When is this? We're going to talk about this in videos to come. But initially, I wanted to lay out the sign, the symbol that's put forth, that has been covered up, the plant wiped out by Jesus Christ, if we follow the scripture in Isaiah that I'm going to put up now, that I've recently found, which pertains to doing just that. Take a look at this and consider the crown of the kingdom.